Oh, milky jelly. This is not the way in which any cook would wish her dessert of lovingly prepared panna cotta to be greeted. However, this was to be, unbeknownst to me at the time, the first of many moments during my post as cook to a family in the Italian city of Bologna that would be described by us here today as very Barbara Pym. Later, as I scraped the sad remains from the plates into the bin, I vowed to try this dessert again and get it right. And so it was rather as a fed-up cook that I made my way to the impressive library in Bologna and to the extensive English section that I found by very happy accident my first Barbara Pym novel, A Glass of Blessings. It seems highly appropriate that I discovered Pym's work in Bologna, the gastronomic capital of Italy, although I think every city in Italy claims that title. And indeed it was the details of the food and drink in the novels that really roused my senses, set the scenes, placed the characters, surprised me, amused me, and sometimes depressed me. Pym describes her characters' meals with the appreciation of a true gourmand. It's obvious she knew about ingredients and cooking, as her letters, diaries, and friends will testify. And she could use this knowledge very subtly to comment on characters and situations, using certain dishes, certain combinations of food, and painstakingly setting the scene of certain cafes and restaurants. We understand a character's social status and outlook, their snobbishness or simplicity, their financial situation, their adventurousness or lack of it. In fact, the very essence of the characters. And of course, nothing sums up more succinctly or poignantly an unfulfilled desire than Daphne, in A Few Green Leaves, her fruitless attempt to live a Greek dream, represented by her English ploughman's version of a Greek salad. A hunk of stale bread, a few small, hard black olives, and something approaching a goat's milk cheese. It was always going to be the food that I wanted to talk about today. What I really want to look at are the ingredients, or the components, of Pym's characters' meals. I think this speaks volumes, and possibly would have done so even more at the time of writing. We seem to have a sliding scale with the very English and traditional meals at one end, ranging all the way to outlandish and unsettling and sometimes foreign dishes at the other. From the safety and, dare I say it, boredom, all the way to the risky and the exotic. And we can often gauge the characters in a similar way when we see what they eat. Prudence Bates, Jane and Prudence, is very much a member of the modern school of cookery. Maybe not outlandish, but distinctly contemporary. Her chosen dishes combine simple but good produce, the war cry of today's chefs, smoked salmon, and a really ripe yellow-fleshed peach. And her coffee does not come from a tin or a bottle. Her meals often have a distinctly continental feel, as in, there was a little garlic in the oily salad, and the cheese was nicely ripe. Food's important to this woman. She's not greedy. She's not even ever mentioned as being particularly hungry, but she's sensitive to the properties of a well-prepared meal using quality ingredients. On being jilted by Fabian Driver, she doesn't down a bottle of gin or gorge on a box of chocolates, but rather prepares herself an impressive breakfast of perfectly browned toast, freshly percolated coffee, orange juice, and perhaps even an egg, causing us to draw in a breath of admiration for her. Such control and precision in times of adversity. Of course, it could be argued that herein lies the downfall of Prudence, the self-control and immaculate perfectionism of the English spinster. Maybe she should just let it all out and binge eat chocolate biscuits all over her uncomfortable Regency furniture. Catherine from Less Than Angels is one of our more progressive and exciting characters regarding food. She's rarely mentioned without the Cypriot restaurant across the road being involved. Her fingers smell of garlic. She throws together risottos and boeuf à la mode and gathers her ingredients from salacious parts of London. It seems amusing today that to even obtain food like Parmesan cheese and olive oil, one had to brave Soho. Although Catherine and Prudence are both modern gastronomes, their styles of cooking differ greatly, and this shows the huge difference in their characters. They're not just the typical modern single woman in their respective stories. Catherine cooks with the abandonment and laid-back ease with which she lives, while Prudence cooks with the utmost care and attention to detail, which is also reflected in her work, dress and behaviour. I love to imagine the two very different kitchens of these women. A modern-day MasterChef competition between them would be highly entertaining. It's interesting to note that after Catherine's romantic rejection, she too finds eating well a comfort. Before Tom's departure to Africa, she also manages a hearty breakfast of toast and a boiled egg. Although later, after her bereavement, her recovery process demands being looked after by members of the old school, those queens of suburban dining, Mabel Swan and Rhoda Welcome. At the start of this novel, we see young Deirdre Swan desperate to be a different type of female, the type of woman that Catherine already is, and she displays a yearning not to change her dress or her hairstyle or her speech, but her bedroom furniture and her eating habits. Some rice, all oily and saffron yellow, with aubergines and red peppers and lots of garlic, is her desire. In A Few Green Leaves, Emma cooks more contemporary food and eats in a very different way, but this is obviously due to the fact that this later novel is simply more modern. But when necessary, this young, single professional woman, this modern, excellent woman, can still easily whip up a tuna mousse and a French onion tart for her guests. Another trait of all the excellent women that is ever present throughout Pym's work is their staunch support of the egg industry. Omelettes, fried eggs, scrambled eggs, and numerous boiled eggs and toast are prepared, usually for one, and served by Emma on one occasion with a gin and tonic. In A Few Green Leaves, we also see convenience foods making their way into Pym's work. Tea bags, fish fingers, and even what sounds suspiciously like a Fray Bentos steak and kidney pudding. And again, we get an insight here into our characters from their reactions to these products. Graham Pettifer sneers at spaghetti hoops and sliced bread. Tom Dagnall seems simply confused. And Adam Prince experiences something like fury. Amusing to note that it's mainly the men who recoil in horror from these foods. No doubt exhausted wives and mothers everywhere were thrilled at their arrival. These foods serve to remind us of progress, but they sound so artificial and unappetising. We also have our slightly older ladies who cook remarkably well and in some cases adventurously. Belinda Bede, based, as we know, on Pym herself, despite her age and her dyed-in-the-wool Englishness, particularly enjoys experimenting with Italian food. She creates a risotto and even makes her own ravioli. The reason for Belinda's delving into foreign recipes, however, is more down to earth. Ever self-conscious, she feels that the maid is always watching her and judging her, so she opts for foreign dishes that she probably won't have heard of. Leonora, from The Sweet Dove Died, is also an excellent cook, but she models again the precise classic method. Always reminds me rather of an ageing Prudence, and produces perfect meal after perfect meal, ending with delicious coffee, which seems to be the hallmark of those with taste in Pym's work. She's a halfway house between the traditional and the slightly more exotic. She too can make a simple omelette for dinner, but she may well begin her meal with an aperitif of creme de menthe. Always setting the right tone with her menu choices, just like her clothes and in her interior decor. Perfectly roasted beef and Yorkshire pudding, chicken with tarragon followed by chocolate mousse, and never getting too adventurous so that a meal becomes a novelty, or even worse, an experiment that could go wrong and lose one's dignity. One always has something. Tins, packets and eggs, she assures James. Yes, there are tins in Leonora's larder, but they don't contain rice pudding or spaghetti hoops. They contain asparagus tips, lobster and white peaches. Mildred's inheritance in Excellent Women doesn't quite stretch to these luxuries. She usually makes do with the trusty egg or some bread and cheese. She's not used to spaghetti and certainly not accustomed to drinking alcohol. And yet we're given glimpses of a potentially discerning diner. She has a precious hoard of olive oil, which she uses sparingly to dress a humble lettuce. She makes delicious coffee. And she's dismayed by the shortcomings of the vicarage meal of pale macaroni cheese, lacking in salt. Here's a woman who appreciates good food when taken to a restaurant or invited to dine at someone's home, and who makes the observation, aimed at Julian and Winifred Mallory, that it's only good, unworldly people who never noticed what they ate or drank. I think it's circumstances, rather than a lack of taste, that lead to her eating baked beans cold from the tin while walking around her kitchen. A beautifully contrasting pair are Dulcie Mannering and Viola Dace in No Fond Return of Love. Dulcie's qualities of reliability, good old common sense and general solidity, traits that many Pym heroines regretfully admit they possess, sit comfortably with the macaroni cheese and home-bottled fruit chutneys that she prepares. And at one point she puts together what could almost be an artisan meal of bread, cheese and tomatoes from the garden, and then serves it with bottled mayonnaise and orange squash. This combination is as down-to-earth and as English as her thin legs and heavy brogues, and I for one applaud her lack of gastronomic snobbery. Viola is the salt to Dulcie's sugar. Her approach to food is eccentric and unpredictable, like her personality. She seems to be uninterested, maybe even turned off by food. She doesn't eat breakfast, something suspicious in a Pym novel. And when she invites Dulcie for dinner, there doesn't appear to be anything to eat. And yet, Pym pulls a surprise out of the shopping basket here, because on further inspection, there's a selection of exotic salads, cold meats, and croissants on offer, with the well-made coffee afterwards. Later on, Viola tries to get Dulcie to stuff the very safe roast duck with olives, but naturally Dulcie prefers the more traditional sage and onions. And of course, the ultimate warning sign of a less than excellent woman. Viola drinks. Often alone, often gin. The woman's a positive maverick. Cowering at the very safe end of our scale is Letty, quartet in autumn, whose breakfast of a boiled egg and a crisp bread leaves us in no doubt as to where she stands regarding new and exciting cuisine, or indeed big changes in life. When she timidly knocks at the door of her new Nigerian landlord, not only does the noise from within alarm her, but significantly, the heavy, spicy smells of unfamiliar cooking. Letty Crow may be a single lady who's worked for a living, but she's a world away from one of Pym's adventurous, anthropological female characters. It may be noted that all these women are single, and many of the married ladies, and I'm not suggesting anything here, but in particular clergy and academic wives, are pretty poor performers in the kitchen. Their offerings of cold meat and beetroot with no potatoes, tinned soup and dried rissoles do nothing to excite us. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Pym was insinuating that all spinsters are great cooks, as we also have Edith Liversidge, who seasons her tin baked beans with cigarette ash, and the perennial Esther Clovis, who cheerfully lives out of tins and on frozen stuff. But let's not forget, these women are a different type. They are much more masculine and rough. They've spent time in the Balkans and in Africa. Their passions lie in the fields of anthropology and sanitary arrangements. Their basic and occasionally unhygienic eating habits reflect how food is for them simply for sustenance. And though they wolf down meals that other people have prepared, they don't seem to taste it or appreciate it. Just as their unattractive clothes and mannish haircuts bypass the pleasures of vanity and frippery, so is cooking something that other people do. And of course, pushing her lack of interest in food to a fatal limit is tragic Marcia in Quartet in Autumn, who eventually dies from starvation, next to her extensive but untouched collection of tinned food. So we encounter many female characters who are not at their best in the kitchen, but we also meet a host of male characters who positively flourish in this domain. Pym flips the commonly perceived roles of each gender and plays with it to great comedic effect. In A Glass of Blessings, it's an utter joy to read of what Wilf plans for the clergy dinners. Scampi with garlic butter, fried octopus, and even escargot. And we take delight in his disdain for poor Mrs. Greenhill's Lenten offerings of boiled cod and macaroni cheese. Keith also takes great pride in the presentation of his afternoon tea for Wilmot, although here we seem to have a comment on class. Keith's shop-bought pink and white gatto and his plastic doilies lay bare his roots, even more than his flat vowels and his inability to speak French. What's different in this novel is that the two ladies of the house, Wilmot and her mother-in-law, Sybil, take little or no interest in the preparation of the food served forth in their own home, although Wilmot does care about what she eats. They obviously have a cook, but there's never any mention of Sybil or Wilmot fretting over what to serve for dinner, or feeling bullied or intimidated by their lack of knowledge. But then Wilmot and Sybil are not these kind of women. Wilmot's birthday dinner of smoked salmon, roast duckling and gooseberry tart is still lovingly described to us, purely for the joy of chronicling a delicious meal. Apart from most of the clergy, who seem blissfully ignorant about what's put in front of them, Again, my apologies. Pym has endowed a lot of her male characters with wonderfully finicky attitudes towards food, which often strips them of masculinity and makes them figures of fun. Apart from Wilf Bason's almost feminine menus, we have, of course, Adam Prince's dainty contributions in A Few Green Leaves. Brilliantly, this man knew Wilf Bason and sampled his delights whilst a fledgling curate. His job now as a food critic demands that he deconstruct every meal he eats, and he also relishes the preparation of his own meals, even down to planning what type of butter to serve with his perfectly al dente spaghetti. Food is used here to highlight the fussy, snobbish personality of Adam Prince, and the more rustic nature of the villagers is felt by their disrespect for his job, which is not regarded as a real man's job. Even the unassuming rector, Tom, has his moments of muddled culinary speculation. When he catches sight of Emma standing in her kitchen cradling a ham mousse, not only does he notice it, but he tries to imagine what it could be and what it could have been made from. Humphrey Boyce and his nephew James, from The Sweet Dove Died, are both amazingly fussy when it comes to food and drink. James realises on entering Phoebe's cottage that it's a mistake to assume that all women are at their best in the kitchen. We smile at his naive but pertinent realisation, and the harshness of his observation made in the middle of an afternoon of lovemaking. Yes, it could be argued that these are simply men of taste, which accounts for their being drawn to Leonora, but their preferences sometimes border on priggishness. Their physical distaste towards Miss Caton's strong Indian tea served in thick white mugs is extreme. And there's a suspicion that Phoebe is deliberately sending up James by making him have tea with her in the leopard dining rooms. This also reminds me of Jessie Morrow dragging a self-conscious Fabian driver for a tea of fish and chips in a slightly down-market cafe, which he eventually learns to enjoy. So now that we've brought the male of the species into the discussion, we cannot fail to mention the good old-fashioned role of food being used by women to lure men to their homes and occasionally to their hearts. The first character who springs to mind is Miss Harriet Bede. Although her delicious offerings are definitely not intended to lead to anything more than a well-fed and grateful curate, there are elements of courtship in her conduct. She keeps a food diary, consulting it to ensure variety and eager to keep up the men's interests. She's jealous on finding out that Agatha Hockleaf has promised Mr. Dunn a batch of apples, and immediately tries to outdo that offer by forcing her own crop of Cox's orange onto him. They giggle together over sticky pears, and unashamedly pick up chicken bones to gnaw all the meat from them. We learn that Harriet's appetite was just as rapacious in her 50s as it had been in her teens, and we immediately assume this refers not only to food. It also works the other way, as later on we see the ever-hopeful Count Riccardo Bianco inviting the Mrs. Bede to tea and ensuring all of Harriet's favourite foods are on offer in another attempt to woo her. Estrogen-filled self-service cafeterias, manly restaurants with joints of red meat exposed everywhere, busy, gossipy tea rooms and bars full of laughing office workers. We're never left in any doubt as to the setting of our meals, and this adds to the rich picture in which our diners sit. Often, joyously, lunches, teas and dinners are described for no reason other than the sheer pleasure of listing appetising or awful food. And why not? When the writer is as appreciative and clever with her choices as Pym, it only ever enriches the story, like a pinch of sugar in a tomato sauce, trade secret to bring out the extra flavour. As a postscript to my sorry beginning, I did attempt the fated panna cotta once more, but this time, having Googled Barbara Pym and found out some more information about her, I revamped it as a mashler pudding, having read that Barbara and her sister Hilary had invented their own milky jelly, which they named after the notoriously cruel publisher. My improvements were noted, and this time, as I cleared away mostly empty plates, like Belinda Bede, when Miss Pryor surprisingly compliments her on the standard of her lunches, I experienced one of those sudden moments of joy that sometimes come to us in the middle of an ordinary day. Thank you.
Bethany, for another very interesting paper. I must say that was my introduction to the concept of gastronomic emasculation. Look that one up. If anybody has any questions for any of our speakers, we have about 10 minutes.